How did those towers come down? Well, before we were told what to think by the experts, let's listen to what some eyewitnesses said.
Actually, devices that were planted in the building. There was another explosion that took...
Huge explosion that we all heard. An explosion,
And another explosion.
All that evidence of explosions was quickly ignored or dismissed. The next morning, the experts had already figured out how those towers fell. In just under an hour, a raging fire from burning aviation gasoline softened or perhaps melted the steel. And we were told that melted steel story for months. The intense fire caused the tower to collapse. It melted the structural steel. What the firemen might not have realized is the gushing jet fuel was melting the steel. Steel melts, and 24,000 gallons of aviation fluid melted the steel.
As the steel began to soften and melt, the interior core columns began to give.
Indeed, there was plenty of evidence of melted steel, including this, and this, molten spheres of iron, steel like Swiss cheese, and of course this. But over time, this melted steel story changed. Even today, the media report and many scientists believe that the steel melted. This is not true. And NIST said that the molten steel was irrelevant to the investigation of the collapse, since it does not provide conclusive information on the condition of the steel when the towers were standing. John Gross of NIST, who was at the yard observing plenty of evidence, denied its very existence.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so.
Except these firemen.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails.
And this eyewitness.
The fires got very intense down there and actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
And this architect.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat into one single element.
Molten iron in explosions is easily explained by incendiaries and explosives, but not by fires. So that evidence had to be ignored and denied. If their melted steel story wouldn't work, then how did they explain how those towers came down? Professor Bazant and others published several scientific papers with rigorous equations proving how the upper top block of floors crushed the lower, larger section down to the ground, and then the upper block crushed itself back up. It neglected to explain how the upper block fell through the inner core columns, or why those core columns fell last. In addition, the theory ignores Newton's third law. But other experts disagreed, and instead we were told that it was a pancake collapse, which contradicted the Bazant piledriver theory.
Then you had this sequential failure that took place where it all pancaked one after the other.
The result is what's called a progressive collapse, as each floor pancakes down onto the one below.
But the pancake collapse also couldn't explain how the core columns fell. And despite all the animations, entire floors collapsing are not what we observed. But NIST said, NIST findings do not support the pancake theory of collapse, which is premised on a progressive failure on the floor systems in the WTC towers. NIST also said their study does not actually include the structural behavior of the tower after conditions for collapse initiation were reached. We were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse. So here we are many years later with no official theory given for the total collapse of the Twin Towers. Since they can't explain the entire collapse, can they at least tell us how the collapse started? After detailed study, the experts said that the floor truss connection to the columns failed first. Many structural engineers believe that the weak points were the angle clips that held the floor joists between the columns on the perimeter wall and the core structure.
At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Professor Eduardo Causel has been carrying out research into the disaster. This computer simulation done at MIT shows how heating the trusses would cause them to fail.
What this simulation shows is that most likely the weak point of the floor were the connections to the supports.
FEMA and the American Society of Civil Engineers agreed, and PBS concurred.
When the steel became weak, the trusses would have collapsed.
All the experts agreed the truss connections failed first, except the NIST experts, who later concluded that the truss connections held firm and did not break away from the columns. Then the experts said that the perimeter columns definitely bowed outward.
and without the trusses to keep them rigidly in place, the columns would have bent outward.
And the FEMA study showed animations of this outward bowing in their study. There was no doubt that the columns bowed outward. That is, until the NIST experts said that the columns definitely bowed in. And then, just before the tower's fall, the experts told us that the columns broke outward. However, the NIST experts concluded that the columns broke inward. While the experts disagreed about how the tower started to fall, they assured us once the structure was weakened, total collapse would be inevitable. The NIST report does not actually involve the structural behavior of the tower after conditions for collapse initiation were reached and collapse became inevitable. But is collapse inevitable? It's not on this structure, and this structure, or this structure. Jonathan Barnett was surprised to find unique steel that had intergranular melting.
It was a surprise to me because it was so eroded and deformed.
The New York Times said it was perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation. But later we were told that it really wasn't a mystery at all.
I don't find it very mysterious at all. That if I have steel in this sort of a high temperature atmosphere that's rich in oxygen and sulfur, this would be the kind of result I would expect.
But the question was not what would happen to steel if it was attacked by sulfur in a high temperature atmosphere. We know that. No clear explanation for the source of the sulfur has been identified. So the real question is, where did the sulfur come from? The government never answered that question. But others did. Dr. Greening said, "It is concluded that sulfur emission was relatively small compared to those involving diesel fuel and CaSO4 in gypsum wallboard." The BBC media experts agreed.
The sulfur came from masses of gypsum wallboard that was pulverized and burnt in the fires.
Except that no experiment with diesel fuel and wallboard can replicate this intergranular melting. And after this experiment was posted, Dr. Greening admitted, "I'm prepared to admit that my initial proposal of how the steel was sulfided during the 9/11 events needs to be modified. Certainly it looks like diesel fuel, gypsum, concrete, and aluminum alone are not going to do it." Yet even after this experiment and admission by Dr. Greening, the debunking experts still claim that this occurred because the sulfur released from burned drywall corroded in the steel as it stewed in the pile for weeks. What about Building 7 that looked exactly like a controlled demolition? NIST struggled with this for years, saying, "But truthfully, I really don't know. We've had trouble getting a handle on Building Number 7. Eventually, we were told that it was the world's first office fire that
caused an extraordinary event.
Earlier, we were told by the experts at Popular Mechanics that the diesel tanks were the problem. Our current working hypothesis is that this pressurized line was supplying fuel to the fire for a long period of time." The History Channel agreed.
The fires were fed by a line supplying diesel fuel to the floor where the fire was most intense.
Even though NIST said
the collapse was also not due to the fuel oil fires, diesel fuel oil, substantial amounts of diesel fuel that were in the building.
NIST said that normal office fires caused a beam to expand, pushing it off its support.
In World Trade Center 7, near a specific column involved in the collapse, column 79.
Controlled demolition was dismissed.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7.
Since they didn't hear the sound from 9 pounds of conventional RDX to blast out column 79.
This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses.
Even though he heard explosions while inside,
Big explosion.
And they heard it. But because NIST never heard anything, they didn't bother to look for explosive residue as recommended, or consider that instead of conventional RDX that makes lots of noise, maybe some high-tech quieter explosives could have been used, like patented thermitic devices that can be employed to demolish a concrete structure at high efficiency while preventing a secondary problem due to noise, flying dust, and chips and the like, or can focus energy by means of a torch-like ejection of hot reaction products and is extremely ignitable, or could be useful for cutting materials including metals, masonry, reinforced concrete, rock, and the like, or consider the wonders of modern explosives as described in the Nanoscale Chemistry Yields Better Explosives article by Lawrence Livermore Labs, or the fact that active nanothermite was found in the dust, and carbon nanotubes, a byproduct of nanothermite, has been found in the first responders' lungs. Or maybe they should have explained what we see happening in this window. which looks more like this than an ordinary fire. At first they told us that Building 7 fell approximately 40% longer than the computed freefall time and was consistent with physical principles. And you had a sequence of structural failure that had to take place. Everything was not instantaneous. But when challenged, NIST finally admitted a freefall descent over approximately 8 stories at gravitational acceleration. Since freefall is impossible with a sequence of failures, NIST quietly removed all references to their model being consistent with physical principles in their final report, meaning the official explanation relies on miracles. So although NIST had trouble getting a handle on building number 7, after many years and a few miracles, they said the obvious stares you in the face. As more independent scientists pointed out that iron microspheres and molten steel could easily be explained by thermitic material, the National Geographic experts tried to explain that thermitic material could not have been used because it won't even cut or melt a steel column.
Despite 175 pounds of thermite packed around the steel column, it remained undamaged.
Except experiment with basic thermate in crude holders proved it could. Like National Geographic, the BBC got a real expert, once again to prove to its viewers that thermite cannot melt steel beams.
So I found them a real boffin, a thermite expert from the University of California.
Just be prepared to put a safe distance between you and the reaction.
Oh my God!
Unfortunately for them, it's clear that 3 kilos of thermite has barely affected the steel beam at all.
Unfortunately for the BBC, it's clear less than 2 kilos appear to have damaged this beam. And even though the debunking experts said, thermite is simply not practical for carrying out a controlled demolition, and there is no documentation of it ever having been used for this purpose. But in 1935 it was used to take down a 3 million pound tower taller than World Trade Center 7, with 1,500 pounds of thermite on the outside of the steel columns. Why couldn't thermite also work if it was placed on the inside of steel box columns? In 2011, an entire new theory was developed to help explain all the eyewitness evidence of explosions that NIST never heard. I believe it's overwhelmingly probable that the theories regarding the cause of the collapse at WTC-1 and WTC-2 are wrong. The disintegrated aircraft probably came to a stop near the center of the buildings, even though the jets were totally shredded in order to knock all the insulation off, according to the NIST fire theory. And we know parts blasted through the tower and fell on the streets below. This new theory says that the aircraft hulls, rather than the buildings, absorb most of the heat from the burning aviation fuel, even though NIST and most others said the aviation fuel burned off in the first few minutes. And the core of his theory is that the molten aluminum then found its way downwards within the buildings through staircases and gaps in the floor. Fortunately, the firemen that rushed up while thousands ran down those staircases somehow managed to avoid the molten aluminum. And after an hour or so, the flowing aluminum underwent a chemical reaction with water from the sprinklers in the floor below. I regard it as extremely likely that it was these explosions that made the skyscrapers collapse. Except the NIST experts said there was no evidence of any blast or explosions in the region below the impact and fire floors. But other establishment experts appear to be having some difficulty with this latest theory. In Professor Bazant's opinion, all factors relating to the collapse have been accounted for, and he thinks the official explanation suffices. Besides, he said, I've explained it in 6 papers in leading journals. And Thomas Eager of MIT said, I do not see any merit to this new, more complex explanation. He pointed out that Occam's razor said that the simplest explanation is usually the best. So using Occam's razor may be the simplest explanation for all those sounds of explosions are explosives. Can an expert propose 2 completely contradictory theories to explain what happened to those towers? Let's find out. Jonathan Kay wrote a book called Among the Truthers and was interviewed on National Public Radio.
And for those who don't trust NIST and don't trust the 9/11 Commission, there's a report, it's called What Did and Did Not Cause Collapse of WTC Twin Towers in New York. These are the report they need to read.
Perhaps just give me a couple of sentences highlighted from that report that you are referring to. What is the explanation for the collapse in that fashion?
Sure. Well, the collapse of WTC 1 and 2 was a floor-by-floor collapse, which initiated global collapse. And this is not especially complicated principle, but as I said, the details are the reports that I cited.
I think it was called like a pancake effect or something.
Well, the pancake effect refers to the floor-by-floor effect. So one floor will collapse, and the impact of the other floor will cause a chain reaction.
So Kay proposes two opposing theories that are both wrong.
In 3 years of interviewing and debating conspiracy theorists, I don't think I have ever won an argument.
I think we understand why. So let's review what the experts told us. There were explosions. There were no explosions. The fires melted the steel. The fires didn't melt the steel. The truss connection broke. The truss connection didn't break. The columns bowed out. The columns bowed in. Building 7 didn't free fall. Building 7 free fell. The sulfur came from the gypsum. Sulfur didn't come from the gypsum. Collapse was inevitable, although it's not inevitable. The experts can't melt steel with thermite, but a novice can. In all the theories we've been told by the media and institutional experts, their melted steel theory is wrong because those fires are too cold to melt that steel. Their crush-down, crush-up pile-driver theory is wrong because it defies Newton's third law and doesn't match observation. The pancake theory is wrong because it defies momentum laws and cannot explain the fall of the core and does not match observation. And their aluminum sprinkler theory is wrong because there is no evidence to support it. And after years of study and millions of dollars, our government doesn't have any theory at all for the collapse, simply saying it was inevitable. And none of their theories can be demonstrated experimentally or explain the molten steel, the iron microspheres, the eutectic formations, free fall, uniform acceleration with no jolts, nanothermite, and much more. So what theory do you believe? Most people would rather believe the corporate media and mainstream experts, even if their theories are wrong and don't make sense. But if you have the courage to look at all the evidence and to independently think using basic laws of physics, you will clearly see the elephant the experts are desperately trying to hide. They want us to never forget 9/11, but also want us to never remember the uncomfortable evidence. Because the experts told us.
The investigation team has studied every possible scenario.
Except the controlled demolition scenario that best addresses all the evidence, and was clear that very first day before the experts had the chance to hide that elephant.
This was clearly, the way the structure is collapsing, this was the result of something that was planned. This is not, it's not accidental that the first tower just happened to collapse and then the second tower just happened to collapse in exactly the same way. How they accomplished this, we don't know.
So how did those towers come down? They were intentionally blown up. The obvious stares you in the face.